let's look at another example. David Crystal last year came out with a book it was called Begats, where he goes through phrases from the King James that have embedded themselves in our language. What phrases do come to your mind when you think of the King James Bible? 23rd Psalm? What else? What's that? The Lord's Prayer. The version of the Lord's Prayer for which we opt is the King James Version. Our Father who art in heaven. How often do you use the verb art? Anybody? Who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Let me tell you, the British in their old days would say, Our Father which art in heaven. Which? Hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I mean, just think how embedded that is. We have to make that choice, right? In our liturgy. And when we opt for the older version as opposed to the contemporary version. I mean, just a suggestion as to which, how that is embedded in how we talk. Another phrase, the fly in the ointment. Who's used that? That's King James. Let me give a few other examples here. How the mighty have fallen. That comes into our, phrases that come into our language, I don't know, in television programs. Anybody watch Hell on Wheels on AMC? Noel, do you? No. Those of us who are into Bible and popular culture, this is what I explained to Ruth. I have to watch these TV shows. It's just part of my job. How many of you saw the movie True Grit last year? Did you catch the cadence of the language in that movie? The Coen brothers are two Jewish guys who grew up in St. Louis Park. But did they capture the King James? They did. Why? Because that was the language of the 19th century. And why was it the language of the 19th century America? It was evangelical, but that was the book that people owned. People read the King James Bible. They knew its grammar, its syntax. It shaped the way people, we read so many things. But if you have only one book in the 19th century, what book do you own? The Bible. And it's going to shape how you talk. It's going to shape how you think. And it's going to shape your conversation. I don't know how people actually talked in the 19th century, but that was the book that people knew, and that's the one they can reference. Let me try a couple others here. Seen the light. What's that?
I have seen the light.
I have seen the light, God in truth and right. And I wander in the night without direction. Okay, that's a Simon and Garfunkel reference. But how many of you know the phrase to see the light? That's King James. What does it mean in our culture?
Come to realization.
Come to realization, come to wise up, come to understand. Just this is the sense in which the phrases we get shape how we perceive reality around us. Let me throw another one at you. pearls before swine. What does that mean? That's King James. It's from a parable. And what does it mean? Do we use that phrase in common day language? Well, sometimes we do. I think of that as I lecture to students. No, don't quote me, please, don't. But how does that shape how we see reality in our relationship to other people? I mean, this is part of the power of language. I'll go through a few more. Do you mind if I do this? The skin of one's teeth. That's from Thornton Wilder, the skin of one's teeth. And where did Thornton Wilder get that?
Oh, yeah.
What is the skin of one's teeth?
Barely escaped.
It's just barely escaped. But here's where stuff, impregnates the language. And we lose the sight of where it even comes from. Again, that's from the book of Job. And what does it say? Again, it's totally dislocated from its biblical origins, but it's part of the language with which we converse with each other.
Bill, was awesome in the King James?
Is what?
Awesome.
Yeah, the King James has the phrase totally awesome. Okay, and here's part of the problem. My ancestors were Norwegian. That's a burden I still carry. They didn't come to the United States until 1870. My wife's ancestors were Swedish. They came much earlier, and they were much more sophisticated than mine. So did my ancestors in Norway have the King James? They didn't. But do I, as an English speaker now of Scandinavian heritage in the United States, inherit the British linguistic tradition? In a way, I do. Be fruitful and multiply. That's King James. What does that mean? And do you remember where that occurs? It's in Genesis. It's a command given again and again in the book of Genesis. Be fruitful and multiply. What does that mean? To breed. Get on with the breeding, says the book of Genesis. But notice how we hear those phrases, and what do we hear? Do we hear that as a positive command? And by and large, most of us like the idea of breeding, but yet the phrase is embedded in our language and our culture. Let me throw a couple more out to you. Sheep and goats. When you think of sheep and goats, what do you think of?
Judgment and separation.
When you think of judgment, separation. Has anybody in this room ever tended to sheep and goats? Noel has. I have on my farm years in North Dakota. Do we have an immediate, except for about 3 of us here, do we have an immediate connection with that? But is that part of our imaginative world? It is. It's not just the King James, but again, they draw on these pastoral images, and we use those terms to shape the way in which we see the world. I often show my students a picture of a judgment scene from a Roman church painted on the ceiling, where you have sheep and goats here, and we use that phrase to separate the sheep and the goats. Let me throw out another. Millstones. What comes to mind when you hear the word millstone? Heavy. A millstone around the neck. Right. A burden. What does that suggest? Penance. Okay. What else? Torture. If you're thrown in the water with a millstone around the neck, what will happen to you? You will have a hard time swimming. It is negative buoyancy. But again, is that term embedded in our language? I don't know. Things change. But take the word apple. Take a bite of the apple. What does that conjure up for you? Sin? Genesis? I see that. I catch that reference in television all the time. To take a bite of the apple. Sometimes you'll see a person, just bite of the apple. And that's King James. Is the Hebrew word apple? No. What's that?
The apple didn't exist to them.
It didn't exist to them. No, but we've put that into the scenario. So we project into the text.
It shows how many apples grew in.
Yeah. It shows how many apples grew in England and in the United States. A fruit. Just the general word fruit. Yeah. No. Now, pomegranate would be nice. So.
The Mac computer.
And what's the connection to the Mac computer? There we have to start talking about the Masons and the conspiracy. Yeah, no. Pride goes before the fall. Ecclesiastes. What does that mean? Yeah, so we have the wisdom tradition. Ecclesiastes is part of the wisdom tradition. And wisdom is not, it's distinct from the rest of the biblical, the rest of the biblical story claims to be revelatory, that is, God revealed this. Wisdom says this is garnered from human experience. Pride goes before the fall. And other phrases from Ecclesiastes, this is what, can everybody agree to that? Yeah, and so the foundation is in human experience.